Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, July 2nd. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He has led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry, and welcome to all of our viewers throughout the United States and throughout the world. The Washington Brief today will focus on Russia and North Korea, the Unholy Alliance. Russia's comprehensive strategic partnership with North Korea is a threat to South Korea, Japan, Northeast Asia, and the United States. What does it mean for South Korea's security, and how should Presidents Joe Biden and President Yoon Yeol respond? Our guest panelist today is very, very well known in this field. Mr. Daniel Hoffman is a Fox News contributor. He also serves on the advisory board of the security consulting group BGR and works as an independent consultant. Before joining Fox News, Hoffman had a distinguished career in the Central Intelligence Agency, where he was a three-time station chief and a senior executive clandestine services officer. Mr. Hoffman also led large-scale intelligence gathering and technical programs, including tours of duty in the former Soviet Union, Europe, and war zones in the Middle East and South Asia. In addition, Dan served as director of CIA Middle East and North Africa Division during 30 years of government service. He's also served in the U.S. military, including an associate professorship with the Army Command General Staff College. He has a Master's of Science from the London School of Economics and a Master's in Public Administration from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Our commentator today is Dr. Alexandre Mansourov, who's an adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's also an adjunct professor of Korean Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Our moderator is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, who is a very well-known commentator on security issues. Formerly, Ambassador DeTrani was special envoy for the six-party talks with North Korea and the director of National Counterproliferation Center and associate director of National Intelligence. Ambassador DeTrani, it looks like we're going to have a great program today. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Thank you so much. We're very fortunate to have Daniel Hoffman with us today, so we could do a deep dive into the very historic meeting between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. Michael, you mentioned a comprehensive strategic relationship, and that's what we saw a few weeks ago when Vladimir Putin visited North Korea. A comprehensive strategic relationship where Kim Jong-un said, we are now allies and moving forward. Obviously, there's so much going on. We could even possibly talk a little about what's happening in the war in Ukraine and how that's moving forward. And this third year, could you imagine a third year with significant casualties on both sides? But also recent elections in Iran and in France. But there's so much to unpack. And again, we're very fortunate to have Daniel Hoffman with us today, who really knows the Russian Federation and Vladimir Putin so well. And this is where we're going to be focusing today. So over to you, Daniel Hoffman.
Okay, thank you so much. And Joe, listen, as you know, you and I spent decades together at the CIA. Our mission at CIA was to see the world through the eyes, especially of our adversaries. In Putin's case, it's through his twisted KGB eyes. So I'm going to start with a little background about Russia and then take that to what we're seeing today in the Korean Peninsula and, of course, the implications for U.S. national security. There's really three important formative experiences in Vladimir Putin's life that we need to keep in mind when we're assessing his foreign policy. The first is, of course, he served in the KGB 16 years. He left the KGB as a lieutenant colonel, and then he went on to serve as the director of Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB. They're the ones responsible for repressing Russia's population and conducting intelligence operations in the former Soviet Union. Secondly, he's got a black belt in judo, and so he likes to use his opponent's strength against him. We've seen that in the United States here. Cyberspace has been certainly a force multiplier for freedom of speech and commerce, and Putin turns that strength of our democracy, a key foundation of our democracy, against us with his own propaganda and disinformation operations. And the third thing, which CIA analysts like to call historical placement, is where does Vladimir Putin come from? Well, he was born in St. Petersburg. He lost his brother during the brutal Nazi Germany army siege on St. Petersburg. Putin was raised in the 1950s amidst all of that that St. Petersburg had suffered. And he lived through understanding what a real existential threat was, not as much to the Soviet Union, but to his own family. And as the Russians like to say, "Svoya rubashka bliže k telu," your own shirt is closest to your skin. That is definitely something that I think Vladimir Putin believes. We also can't consider the relationship between Russia and Ukraine absent the shift resulting from Russia's brutal and failed invasion against Ukraine and the ongoing war there, which has resulted in hundreds of thousands of Russian casualties, a brain drain of reportedly 1 million Russians who fled the country, NATO membership for Finland and Sweden, and Europe awakened from its post-Cold War slumber, more committed now than ever to its collective defense. In response to all of that, Vladimir Putin has become more aggressive. His risk calculus has changed. He's used rhetorical nuclear brinkmanship in an effort, successfully, in my view, to induce the Biden administration to delay or in some cases withhold the military equipment that Ukraine needed, first to stay in the fight and then to mount that counteroffensive that really fizzled last summer. Putin has also used his military intelligence, the GRU, to mount hybrid operations overseas in Eastern Europe in particular against railway network. He's jammed GPS networks, signals in the Baltic states. And of course, he's become more brazen in his efforts to demonstrate some throw weight in our hemisphere, in Venezuela and in Cuba. And we've seen this outgrowth, this century's axis of tyranny, where Russia has become more aligned than ever before with Iran and China and North Korea. I view that as an indication of Vladimir Putin's weakness, not his strength. He relies on Iran for drones, on China for export of hydrocarbons, and of course on North Korea for artillery, and most recently for North Korean engineers to come back to the cities that have been destroyed on Russian lines to rebuild those places. So I think that Vladimir Putin's visit to Pyongyang, it's definitely part of his cold calculus. It's also a bit of an act of desperation. He needs North Korea, and he also needs the relationship to be very much public. It's as we begin to discuss this new strategic partnership, which is built upon previous deals signed between those two countries in 1961 and 2000, and most recently in 2001. Now there's a mutual assistance pact in the event of aggression. It's a little bit innocuous about exactly what that means, but Putin was deliberately very public about that. And part of what he's doing in North Korea, in my view at least, is a bit of that KGB information operations to demonstrate to the United States and South Korea and our other allies, particularly Japan and Philippines, Australia, that there's a price for being Russia's enemy. If South Korea provides arms to Ukraine, then there'll be a cost in the Korean Peninsula to South Korea. Vladimir Putin wants to demonstrate that Russia can really be a thorn in our side. Russia's currency, in terms of what they can provide Iran and North Korea and China, when they are receiving some diplomatic support, and again, the necessities that they need to keep their war economy running, of course, space and military technology, that's incredibly important for North Korea as they seek to build out their ballistic missile program and the potential for a multiple armed re-entry vehicle where you could carry multiple nuclear weapons. That's something that Kim Jong-un would like to develop. And of course, we know that Russia's given North Korea a lot of food assistance and diplomatic top cover, most recently in March when Moscow vetoed a UN resolution to renew independent monitoring of North Korea's violations of the Security Council's sanctions. That raises a lot of concern about weakening controls on Kim Jong-un's illegal weapons system. So this is a long-standing relationship. I'll leave it to my friend and former CIA colleague Joe DeTrani to talk about how it began, if there's some value there about how the Soviet Union propped up Kim's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who rose to power in the 1940s, thanks to Soviet intervention. But there's just a long-standing relationship between these two countries, broken a bit in the Boris Yeltsin years, but Vladimir Putin definitely saw the benefits of re-engaging, and he's doing it with an eye towards countering his main enemy, the United States. The challenge for us in the United States is that with Russia's backing, Kim Jong-un has ramped up his bellicose language, scrapped a long-standing policy of seeking peaceful reunification with South Korea, and raised concerns about developing the technology, ballistic missile technology, that will enable North Korea really to strike the United States homeland. All of that makes today, arguably, more dangerous, more risky for U.S. national security than ever before, not just in the Korean Peninsula, but throughout the world. I think we face more wickedly complex threats to our national security right now, today, than ever before. And good on everyone serving in the U.S. military, the intelligence community, state, local, federal law enforcement, because we need them. Attach to all of those threats, the terrorist threats that we face, and a heightened terrorist alert on top of all of this. And the fact that we don't have the relationships with some of these foreign nations who are really our adversaries more than they've ever been before, so that we could potentially come together to deal with those terrorist threats. And we're not going to see that either. That's a big challenge for the Biden administration. The last point I'll make is that one of the strengths of our country during the Cold War was that, for the most part, Democrats and Republicans were able to come together and agree on foreign policy, even if they didn't agree on much when it came to domestic policy. But in today's acrimonious partisan divide, we don't see a lot of collaboration really anywhere. I think the Speaker of the House was able to deliver that military supplemental, providing some assistance to Ukraine and Israel, and that's been an aberration. But this issue in the Korean Peninsula really does demand more in the way of bipartisan collaboration. And I think it's an important issue on which the two main party candidates should be commenting. So I'll leave it there and over to our other esteemed panelists to discuss further.
Thank you, Dan. No, that was quite a wrap up. A lot of issues there, Dan, to unpack. You talked about the GRU, Vladimir Putin's service in the GRU, and how he's reached out to Venezuela, Cuba, but indeed in this case, North Korea. And you spoke of the axis of authoritarian states, Iran, China, and indeed the Russian Federation. So there's so much to unpack, and I think I want to focus on this, and I'll look to Alexander to continue with this excellent discussion, is that Vladimir Putin's focus is on the United States. And this alliance with the DPRK, North Korea, a lot of it is directed at the United States. And this is a very, very important point, because we really have to sort of sort this out when we look at the war in Ukraine, and it's going into its, as we just said, it's going into its third year with significant casualties. What does this all mean? How do we unpack that? And how do we seek to move in a different direction so that we can get a peaceful resolution to the war in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera? Over to you, Alexander.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador, very much. And then excellent opening of our discussion. I really enjoyed your straight to the point kind of strategic communication piece, if you wish. But before we talk about the big issues, and that is which are consequential for the rest of the world, that is what's happening in the United States. Let's talk about the summit, June 19th summit. I'll describe the context, and then lay out a few interpretations of the meaning of that summit, and raise a question for this iteration of our discussion. So speaking about the context, both Russia and North Korea, they face similar external conditions, diplomatically isolated, both under economic and financial sanctions, North Korea for 70 years, Russia for the past decade, both basically under geopolitical pressure, NATO expansion in Europe, now NATO's outreach in Asia, facing Russia, as well as, the consolidation of Japan, South Korea, US trilateral relationship in Northeast Asia, AUKUS Quad in the Pacific, all putting pressure on both Russia and North Korea. So external conditions are the same, and this is all in the context of escalating Russia-NATO proxy war in Ukraine, military escalation in Ukraine, with the United States and NATO providing longer range, high precision offensive weapons with the permission to strike Russian territory, and a threat to deploy NATO troops to Russia, which clearly is shaping Russian military calculus on the theater of war. And that is at the time when North Korea was supplying artillery shells to Russia, and directly, and South Korea indirectly supplying ammunition to Russia as well. Now also add to that Russian decision to transfer theater nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. Again, on the Korean theater, the United States and South Korea decided to set up a nuclear consultative group. Yes, ostensibly to deal with North Korean nuclear threat, but again, if you are in the Russian General Staff, you interpret it much broader than that. And all that at the time of real geopolitical realignment, when the United States, as a policy, basically set its eyes on strategic defeat of Russia. We see a complete breakdown of Russian relations with the West, with Europe. President Putin is trying to pivot to the East, which resulted in a significant deepening of Russian-Chinese strategic partnership. And I do believe that there were advanced consultations on Putin's visit to North Korea with Xi Jinping when he met with the Chinese leader in May. As Dan correctly pointed out, Pyongyang abandoned its unification line and also pivoted to consolidate its alliances with China and Russia. And this is all, again, in the context of the US-Chinese deepening confrontation. So what is the meaning of that summit between Putin and Kim? And there are different interpretations. And I would like to know where Dan stands on it. Obviously, the official line from Moscow is there was a strategic breakthrough. This new strategic comprehensive partnership is based on shared interests, shared values, shared perceptions of the world. And by the way, they say it's nothing new. Back in 1961, they made similar type of mutual security guarantees under the 1961 treaty. Also, the Kremlin likes to point out that this is a similar treaty to what the Chinese have with North Koreans. The North Korean-Chinese Mutual Defense Treaty of 1961, containing the same mutual defense obligations. In this Russian-North Korean treaty, it's Article 6 plus mutual security consultations, Article 3 plus Article 16, which binds both countries to work together to sabotage, derail, and dismantle international sanctions. So, strategic move, that's one interpretation, which will have basic reverberations all around Northeast Asia. But there is an alternative interpretation saying, no, this is just opportunistic move. It's not really about North Korea. It's part of President Putin's geopolitical maneuvering to divert US attention from the Ukrainian theater to increase pressure on the United States at the point of its vulnerability. And then, Nikita Khrushchev once said that he wanted to put a hedgehog in Uncle Sam's pants. And I quote here Khrushchev's memoirs. So that's what they're trying to do, opportunistically to create trouble for the United States, set up fire somewhere else to deflect our attention from Europe. Now, that's the second interpretation, opportunistic move. Obviously, there is an ideological narrative in the United States that it's an axis of evil being reincarnated, axis of authoritarianism being reinstitutionalized, challenging the world democracy. So that's ideology. Kind of let's leave it there. Obviously, then when you said it's an act of desperation, an act of humiliation, it's an example of rogue state behavior to be deterred and countered. Again, I understand where it's coming from. That's strategic communication being put out there by this government. But there is the last interpretation suggesting that this is a tactical move, and something you alluded to, and I'd like to highlight that. Essentially, some analysts believe that this is an attention-seeking, U.S. attention-seeking kind of act when the Kremlin essentially saying, look what we've got here, this North Korean card which we can play if you continue to harass us in Ukraine. And if you think about all the statements made at the news conferences in Pyongyang and Hanoi, they sounded like trolling. Okay, NATO provides security guarantees to Ukraine. Okay, we'll provide a security guarantee to North Korea here. NATO supplies F-16s, Patriots to Ukraine. We'll supply Sukhoi 35s, S-400s to North Korea. We're just doing exactly what you are doing, so you can't hold us responsible. You can't hold us responsible for that. And if anything, of course, in the more sinister interpretation is that it's a piece of blackmail, and you alluded to it. You'll have to pay a price. You'll pay a price if you try to support our enemy. The message was from Kremlin to South Korean administration. You'll regret it very much. Why? Of course, the message to the United States was, look at this boogeyman. I mean, we honor red lines, but this crazy guy, Kim, he doesn't know what the meaning of the red line is. I mean, he can press that button anytime. Nobody will control him. And so if you don't play ball, we'll enable him to really hurt you badly with our navigation and control systems for his intermediate or long range or intercontinental ballistic missiles, with our GPS systems, with our satellite imagery, geospatial intelligence, etc., etc. So this is my question to you. I mean, as an analyst, as a practitioner, I mean, where do you stand on this? Is it a strategic move designed to reshape Northeast Asian strategic landscape, strategic architecture, or is it an opportunistic move, basically designed to deflect US pressure from Ukraine, or is it a tactical move essentially aimed at kind of upping the ante a little bit, where the Russians, they're more like pretending, imitating, if you wish, rather than really trying to change anything. They're just taking advantage of a guy who is vulnerable, who is really dependent on them. They'll feed him, they'll fuel his economy, they'll provide him with some technologies which he can use to harass his enemies. But really, the moment when they lose interest, they'll turn the other way, they'll get back to the business as usual. So where do you stand on it? Strategic, tactical, opportunistic, or all of the above?
Okay, so a couple things. First of all, Russia is diplomatically isolated and heavily sanctioned because Russia invaded Ukraine. It's going back to 2014. That's perfectly justified. The war in Ukraine could end right now if Russia stopped raining down hell on Ukrainian civilians. And whatever assistance the United States has provided Ukraine is to blunt that Russian invasion. That's defense of a country's territorial integrity. It's part of the UN Charter, which Russia has brazenly violated. It's not, Putin likes to mirror image things and say, oh, if you're supporting Ukraine, we'll support North Korea. We didn't invade North Korea. The United States and our allies are defensive. We're trying to deter others from taking military action. We're trying to deter China from launching an invasion of Taiwan. We're trying to deter North Korea from launching attacks on its neighbor, South Korea. So there, Vladimir Putin, that's his twisted KGB logic. The North Korea visit was a bit of Potemkin Village propaganda, where he does want to make it appear like Russia has this strong relationship with North Korea to scare us, to extort us, and make it clear that there's a cost, to raise the cost of being Russia's adversary. The risk that Putin runs is that all that help he's giving to Kim Jong-un in North Korea, which will assist North Korea's military, help them evade sanctions, help them build out their nuclear program. All those things carry a risk. And I can tell you from all the time that I've spent Russian operations, meeting with Russian intelligence officers, which I've done a lot of over my CIA career, they're going to be concerned about this. Russian national security officials, Russian intelligence officers have to be concerned about Putin's rhetorical nuclear brinkmanship, where he's threatening tactical nuclear war because of the invasion that he launched on Ukraine, and that Ukraine has the right to defend themselves and protect their civilian population from Russia's onslaught. That's a concern. There's a potential for miscalculation. And when you're providing assistance to North Korea and in effect aiding and abetting Kim Jong-un so that he could be even more brazen and more aggressive in the region, that also carries risks. And so the risk for Vladimir Putin is that his own security officials see this. Why has the CIA put out 3 videos to recruit Russians? Because they probably work. And Russian officials are seeing that Vladimir Putin's failed war in Ukraine is causing his risk calculus to put his country at greater risk than ever before. And they're more likely to want to save their country, as their predecessors have done during the Khrushchev years. It's a good one, good example. Cuban Missile Crisis. How did we solve that? Well, Oleg Penkovsky and U-2 spy flights, thank goodness. So we've always depended on those sources with access to the plans and intentions of whoever's in the Kremlin. And we're more likely now than ever before to get that intelligence. The last thing I'll say, and I'm sure you all are familiar with this, Alexander. One of the things that a Russian intelligence officer told me once, he said, if we can kind of solve today's problem, that is for Vladimir Putin staying in the Kremlin, but we create a bigger one for tomorrow, that's okay. And that's what Putin has done. He's going to remain in power as long as he does, until eventually he's removed from power or dies in the Kremlin. But he's creating bigger and bigger problems for Russia. They are suffering from an inflationary economy, and they are isolated, and they could be sending their kids to schools in Western Europe, and they could be avoiding the environmental catastrophe that is Ukraine right now, that they have caused. They could avoid all that stuff and deal with their own problems. But they're not doing that. They're creating bigger problems for tomorrow. And no one sees that more clearly than Putin's own senior national security intelligence officials. And that, I think, I say this with the optic of somebody who served at CIA, that's why it's happy hunting right now for the U.S. intelligence community on Russia. And there's an irony there, because Vladimir Putin is the KGB operative in the Kremlin, and he's made his own intelligence services more vulnerable than maybe they've ever been before to recruitment by the main enemy, United States. And that's on top of all the other intelligence failures we've seen from him, failing effectively to assess the will and capacity of Ukraine to fight, of Zelensky to lead Ukraine, of Europe to be awakened from this post-Cold War slumber. Massive intelligence failures for Putin, including understanding his own military, riddled with corruption and poor logistics and planning. This has been a wild failure for him, but he's holding on because he's an authoritarian dictator who can run his government and use his his internal security, the FSB, to repress his population. The last point I'll make, and I made this at the very beginning about terrorism, we have to be very concerned about our own withdrawal from Afghanistan, which left ISIS and Al-Qaeda with a lot of open field running in the ungoverned space to plot and plan against us here in the homeland. ISIS has launched attacks in Russia, and there's no, see something, say something in Russia. If people see that maybe there might be some attacks being planned or something, they're not going to run to the FSB, the same guys who are giving them wood shampoos on the street and denying them freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. And so Putin runs the risk of more intelligence, more terrorist attacks as well in Russia. So listen, I perhaps after having served so many years in Russia, I'm overly sensitive to anything that sounds like apology for Vladimir Putin or Russia. They are at fault for all of this. And the response from the international community is in defense of territorial integrity of countries being threatened or already having had their territorial integrity violated. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. And thank you, Alexander, for the question and the narrative that preceded the question. Dan, let me pivot a little to South Korea. This comprehensive strategic partnership between North Korea and the Russian Federation. Alexander mentioned 1961, a peace and friendship treaty, as similar to what China did in 1961, where China consummated a strategic relationship with North Korea. But I remember very clearly in some of my track 2 discussions, and this goes back a few years, with a Russian colleague in a track 2 discussion, I said, you're allies with North Korea. And he said, Mr. DeTrani, you have to get it correct. We are not allies of North Korea. We have this treaty of 1961, but it's not the same as with China, where North Korea is indeed an ally of the People's Republic of China. But that was not the case. But I think it is now the case with this recent visit of Vladimir Putin and with this recent comprehensive strategic partnership. And Kim Jong-un put it out there very clearly, we are now allies. So the relationship is a bit different now, where North Korea is going to be looking to the Russian Federation. And as you said, Dan, right up front, historically, they've been getting a lot of missile assistance from the Russian Federation, and a lot of North Korea's strategic, if you will, ballistic missile programs are based a lot on Russian technology and training in Moscow at the universities and so forth. But I think now and we saw this with the when the Soviet Union imploded in 1991, that relationship sort of dissipated. It was downgraded significantly. Now it's back in the fore. And if you're sitting in Seoul, South Korea, you're saying, my God, what is going on here? Because we have a North Korea now that is talking about, it's not only we have a nuclear deterrent, they're talking about the first use of nuclear weapons, talking about if indeed an imminent threat, take the weapons. They're talking South Korea as being, and the United States, but indeed South Korea is the enemy and not a peaceful reunification of the peninsula and so forth. So if you're sitting in Seoul, South Korea, you got to be wondering what is going on now. And that's why there is a discussion in South Korea. One, do nuclear weapons, rely on the United States, deterrence commitments, the Washington Declaration, etc. Do we need our own nuclear weapons? And two, maybe we should provide Ukraine with the weaponry necessary to fight off the Russian onslaught, war of aggression against Ukraine. So there's a lot going on here, and Russia recently has, at the deputy foreign minister level, has reached out to South Korea to say, relax, it's not directed at you. We still want a good relationship, etc. But I think there is a sense in South Korea that North Korea now is emboldened. North Korea now will be going beyond what they did in 2010 when they took down the Chang'an frigate and killed 47 sailors. They will continue to be emboldened and provocative and so forth. And the South Koreans got to say, Russia, you've put us in a very difficult position right now. So my question to you is this then. If you were sitting in Seoul, South Korea, if you were advising the Yoon Suk-yeol government, would you counsel them to consider providing weaponry to Ukraine so they could fight off this war of aggression? Would you encourage them to maybe look at, as de Gaulle did in 1961 when he told President John F. Kennedy, thank you very much for the nuclear umbrella, but we need our own nuclear weapons. We need to defend ourselves. And you use the term often correctly so, deterrence, deterrence, deterrence. That will deter the aggressor. So what would you counsel South Korea, given this recent comprehensive strategic partnership between the Russian Federation and North Korea?
Well, you just laid it out so succinctly, Joe. Gosh, I find myself in 100% agreement with your analysis there, and I would like it very much if you could go deliver that straight to the White House, because they could use that analysis right now. The only one last point I'll make is that I'm not sure that Russia's outreach to North Korea is aligned with China's interests in the Korean Peninsula, and so that may be something that we can exploit. Not so sure that China appreciates that Kim Jong-un could bring instability to that region. I do believe that there's nothing to be gained from appeasing the dictator. We learned that from the Second World War. And so if South Korea's plan was to assist Ukraine, they should carry on with that plan. And as far as their own nuclear deterrent, I think they need to start having more open discussion about it, whether they actually take that and fulfill that plan of having nuclear weapons in South Korea as a deterrent is another matter, but having more discussion about it and making clear that this is something that they could do, which probably Pyongyang would not want, before they take the full step of actually having nuclear weapon deterrent, a nuclear capability. But I do believe those are the two key issues. And I think that broadly speaking as well, from the United States perspective, we have to recognize that Russia and Iran, Russia and China, they're long-term strategic competitors, not allies. We need to do everything we can to drive a wedge between Russia and China, as well as Russia and Iran. And we can do that most effectively with our allies in the Middle East and in Asia, as well as Europe. And I think we need to be doing that as well. I think the Biden administration has done a good job, frankly, engaging with our allies and partners in Asia, particularly with the Philippines and with Japan and South Korea, and bringing particularly Japan and South Korea together to confront the China threat. And I think that's got to be part of our overall strategy is to continue to enhance the throw weight of our alliance in that region.
Thank you, Dan. That was excellent. Thank you. Alexander, please.
Hey, thank you, Ambassador. First, couple of quick comments on China, Russia, North Korea. I do believe that the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership is so important to the Kremlin that they went an extra mile to consult with the Chinese before this visit. And of course, we can try to, we can be self-delusional saying, no, this is a wedge which we can explore here. And maybe long-term, that's our goal. But I'm sure they were very careful to make sure that the Chinese are aware, that the Chinese are on the same page. And if anything, Moscow, and that's the worry North Koreans have, that Moscow is not going to go further than the Chinese want them to go with respect to the North Koreans. They're going to do only as much as the Chinese are willing to live with in terms of their cooperation with the North Koreans. And that's the fear in Pyongyang. One, but second, now that Russia and North Korea are military allies bound by a mutual security pledge, just like North Koreans and Chinese military allies bound by a mutual defense pledge. That brings Russia into the Taiwanese situation. Russia does not have a mutual defense clause with China, mutual defense commitment with China. And if it does anything vis-a-vis Taiwan, Russia could have done pretty much the same what the Chinese did on the Ukrainian situation. Sit on the sidelines, on the fence, provide some economic support, diplomatic recognition, but no military support. Now, Russia is bound by its obligation to defend North Korea, which is bound by its obligation to come to help to China if China gets into action in Taiwan. Indirectly, that signing of this mutual defense treaty between Russia and North Korea, it brings Russia into the Chinese-Taiwanese contingency as well. That's number one. Number two, on South Korea and Ukraine. I think my personal opinion, what happened with this treaty, this new comprehensive partnership, in part, the Yoon administration bears responsibility for that. I mean, they had no business in Ukraine, supplying weapons, imposing sanctions. I know Allied solidarity under the framework of the kind of US-South Korean alliance, they did it, but that's what stirred, ire in Russia and basically put them on the spotlight and, in a way, in my opinion, forced the Kremlin's hand, to kind of choose South Korea as a whipping boy, to show that, you'll have to pay the price if you do something like this. I agree with them. People in Moscow, they regard North Korea with disdain, with a lot of condescension. 30 years of proof we have to support it. Even, the Putin's government, which, by the way, endorsed, 11 UN Security Council resolutions. It wasn't Yeltsin, it was Putin who did that. And so for them, this is a major U-turn, 180-degree turn in policy, what Putin did last, on June 19th. I would argue against his wishes, just like Dan suggested. Why? Because of what South Koreans are doing in Ukraine, the positions they took. And again, I understand why the Yoon government has taken those positions. That's part of their own strategic calculus as being good allies of the United States. But again, there is a significant trust deficit between Moscow and Pyongyang. After 3 decades of hiatus in this bilateral relationship, Kim Jong-un still fears that the current window of opportunity in relations with Russia, which was opened up last month, may close anytime. Why? Because of Putin's unpredictability. And so Kim decided he must he must front load all his demands as much as possible to get everything he wants from Russia as soon as possible. Why? Because the man in the Kremlin cannot be trusted. That's the North Korean expectation. And so despite the praise of President Putin, North Korean officials, they're still worried that he is not decisive enough. He hesitates too much. He revealed weakness, and he waits too long before acting. That's the fear in Pyongyang. That's why Kim is doing what he is doing as fast as he can to get as much as he can as soon as possible. So that's my analysis. In addition to the fact that North Koreans believe that really their country is of much lower priority for Moscow than, for example, Ukraine or even Syria. And Northeast Asia definitely is of lower priority for Moscow than the Middle East, let alone the post-Soviet space, as Dan, you know it very well. And so, yes, there are opportunities which the US ROC allies can exploit in trying to slow down this process of rapprochement, which, by the way, has happened much faster than anybody expected. These two countries got much closer than anybody expected.
Alexander, do you have a question for Dan, Alexander?
Yes, absolutely. And the question is very simple. Ambassador, you mentioned, you asked about the impact on South Korea. What should they do? Go nuclear or send some weapons to Ukraine. But the problem is, we just had a presidential debate, which in my opinion was much more consequential for the rest of the world than Putin-Kim summit, especially because of what we saw, the performance of one of the presidential candidates. And so now half of the world is gloating, and that's not the friends of the United States. And they say, we told you so. This country is run by the cabal. We don't know who's making any decisions, and they're talking about democracy. And the other half of the world is really in shock and worrying about the future. They're rushing to institutionalize all their security commitments, for the post-Biden world. I read the editorials this morning in South Korea, and they're all in shock. They're saying, look, what can we do to prepare for the transition to the second Trump administration? If we send weapons to Ukraine, we may find ourselves on a limb, when the new US president will cut us off. If we go nuclear, we may find ourselves on a limb. So my question to you is, again, add into your equation this factor of a transition from one administration to another come November. And then again, what would you do? Would you still recommend the Republic of Korea to send weapons to Ukraine or go nuclear? Or would you, as some editorials in South Korea suggested, maybe we should pay up and, instead of $1 billion, contribute $5 billion to common defense? Or maybe we should try to reach out to the enemies and strike some deals with them and be more reconciliatory with them, because we can't really expect anything good from a new administration if it comes to power.
Over to you, Dan.
Yeah, I'll just say real quickly, Alexander, those are some good points worth considering. And look, there's no question that it's not just our adversaries, but our allies as well, who are keenly focused on U.S. political developments and what that means for them. And there's a lot of speculation right now because we've got yet a few more months before the election. And when all of this comes into clear focus, it'll be after November 5th when we have a winner and we know whether it's going to be, I assume President Biden is going to stay in the race. We still don't even know that. It's possible that he will withdraw. But it could be him or some other Democrat, or it could be another Trump administration. But look for that lame duck period, December, January timeframe, when a new administration potentially is gearing up for our allies and adversaries to mount the sort of full court press you're talking about to determine where we're headed. The thing is, and Joe and I both experienced this in our decades at CIA, is sometimes you want to collect intelligence, but it's not there because it doesn't exist yet. I don't think the Trump team has definitive plans on what they want to do or don't want to do yet. They're trying to win the election. We're not seeing policy papers really, and we're not seeing the former President Trump being super clear about his foreign policy, national security strategy either, nor should he be. Doesn't need to be. But once things become clear in the United States, that's when I think all of those countries you're talking about are going to swivel and have to make some difficult decisions. But it'll be based on how a second Biden administration or another Trump administration responds to these challenges, and then bilateral discussions that will heat up very, very quickly, including with a transition team if former President Trump wins another term.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Alexander, for your question and your narrative prior to the question. Dan, let me just posit a few things based on what you said up front, and I applaud what you said, and I'm in total agreement. Looking at the relationship of the United States with the DPRK, with North Korea, I mean, I'm sort of going back to 1994 and Jimmy Carter meeting with Kim Il-sung and then the Geneva Convention discussions and with the agreed framework, and we got sort of get together. And what we heard from Kim Il-sung to Jimmy Carter was, we do want a normal relationship with the United States. And indeed, we heard this through the six-party talks from 2003 to 2009, we want a normal relationship with the United States. But it was always on North Korea's terms. Treat us the way you treated Pakistan. You accepted Pakistan as a nuclear weapon state. We could be good friends of the United States. I heard this so many times in my negotiations with the North Koreans. We could be such good friends. The highly enriched uranium issue came into play. That affected that relationship. But we saw that also with the former President Donald Trump and his meetings with Kim Jong-un in Singapore, which was pretty positive, I thought. Hanoi obviously didn't go as well or well at all. But the fact of the matter is, North Korea has always reached out seeking a normal relationship with the United States. And it's no mystery why. They would no longer be a pariah state. They would no longer be heavily sanctioned. They could become part of the family of nations with the direct foreign investment, et cetera, the World Trade Organization, even membership in the World Trade Organization. It could change the whole, and we saw this again in Singapore and to some extent in Hanoi. This is where Kim Jong-un wanted to be, where his father, Kim Jong-il, wanted to be, where his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, wanted to be, and so forth. And now we're sitting here and we're saying a comprehensive strategic relationship with the Russian Federation. What went wrong? You mentioned the panel of experts where Russia vetoed extension of the panel of experts that would monitor the sanctions, the implementation of those sanctions imposed on North Korea from UN Security Council resolutions. That's been disbanded. The fact is that China is working with the Russian Federation to ensure that there are no further sanctions imposed on North Korea for violating UN Security Council resolutions on missile launches, on nuclear tests, etc. So it's gone the other way. And you have to wonder, what did we lose here? And I use that word lose here. We had momentum with North Korea because they wanted that relationship. And now they've reached out and embraced the Russian Federation. You have to wonder. And what we've said in the past, maybe we will contain them, we will deter them. Well, we haven't contained North Korea. They've embraced Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation. They're emboldened now. They'll get more nuclear assistance, more missile assistance, satellite assistance. You talked about multiple warheads on missiles, etc. There's no question about that. More of a threat. So we've not contained them very well. And deter them, well, yes, they're not suicidal. They know using a nuclear weapon will be the end of the Kim Jong-un regime. That whole family, North Korea would be finished. We've said that publicly. And so they're not. But what we've not deterred them with is building more nuclear weapons. Having nuclear tests. The most recent one in 2017 of a thermonuclear weapon. So eventually we have to say, we failed. Let's face up. We never use this terminology. We just sort of move on and we move on. Well, Afghanistan just happened and so forth. The fact is, our policy towards North Korea has not been successful. Has not been successful. You mentioned a minute ago, Dan. You said China. You mentioned China. And indeed, it was China in the six-party talks that came to the fore, where President George W. Bush reached out to Jiang Zemin, where our Secretary of State, Colin Powell, reached out to his counterpart in China, and they created the six-party talks. So should we be looking to China? I mean, this is one of the issues where we have mutual interests. We don't want North Korea with nuclear weapons because it's destabilizing. It's not only a threat to South Korea, it destabilizes the region. And I would say the same. China has that view. I don't think they want instability in Northeast Asia, indeed on the Korean Peninsula. So denuclearization. So what more should we do on the China piece, Dan? Is that something that's viable? Or are we so committed to making China the enemy that there's no way we can cooperate on things like North Korea? We're doing it on fentanyl. We're talking about AI. We're talking about climate change. Why not North Korea? which is an existential threat to our allies in South Korea and Japan.
That's such a great point. And what I appreciate the most, aside from your expert analysis, is intellectual honesty. If there's one thing I learned at CIA, it's you got to tell your boss, whether it's the director or the White House, what they need to know, and especially when it's not what they want to hear. Yeah, our policy for North Korea, total failure. And I agree with you about China. I think China recognizes that Russia is a dangerous and expensive ally. Look how China would like to be able to export their goods to Europe and have productive commercial relationships with Europe. But the Europeans rightly say, hey, you're providing the assistance to Russia that keeps them in the fight against Ukraine, and that's a threat to Europe. We can't have that. So China understands, I think, that Russia's recklessness, Vladimir Putin's recklessness from the Kremlin, carries with it a cost to them. I agree with you. Call out our policy in North Korea for the failure that it's been. I was in Singapore and Hanoi covering those summits for Fox News. And what I saw was the potential, and I'll leave it to the experts like you, Joe, to round out the contours of what it would look like for a grand bargain with North Korea, where you recognize we're not going to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, not unless there was some, by the standards of Kim Jong-un, cataclysmic regime change. But to be realistic about it and accept the fact that they have a nuclear capability and maybe hold it in place and deal with them and manage the security implications of that nuclear program and the threat in the peninsula better than we are right now. Could we do a better job would be my question. Is there another way to engage with North Korea that would dial down the risks that we face in that region and to our country and the homeland? I think there is, and I think you make a really good point about it. And yes, it's something we should be talking to China about. This is one where we both share a great interest. Fentanyl, for sure, an interest on our part. The Chinese get the benefit of hurting the United States and forcing us to deal with a real crisis at our border. But this one, North Korea, that's got a lot of interest for China and the United States. I agree with you 100%. I'd love to see bilateral U.S.-China talks. Nothing would bother Vladimir Putin more than to see that. And that would be of great benefit to us, but frankly, to the Chinese as well. And that would be the kind of bold thinking you'd like to see down on Foggy Bottom at the State Department.
Thank you, Dan. We're coming up to the hour. This has been just an excellent discussion of so many issues. But indeed, the North Korea piece and this new comprehensive strategic relationship with the Russian Federation is so important. And I think the points you made this morning, just this afternoon, just outstanding. And Alexander, I like your commentary and the questions. Michael, thank you for hosting us. The Washington Times Foundation does a great job of educating and communicating with the public writ large on all these national security issues. So thank you, Michael. This is very important, and thank you to the Washington Times for permitting us to have a discussion like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. And it was a wonderful program. And thank you, Dr. Mansourov, for your insights. And Dan, we're very honored to have you with us. We thank you for your wonderful columns in the Washington Times. And we also want to mention the threat status, a new program that's come through the Washington Times daily, media, and also is now doing interviews and podcasts. It's been very, very effective. Dan has been part of it, and Guy Taylor runs it, and it's really taking off with getting up to date and most current information that's maybe only 10 minutes old, and going out every day in newsletters. So that's been very helpful. And we really want to thank the Washington Times, Chris Dolan, and also Guy and his team for covering the Washington Brief, which gives it a very nice reach, especially in Northeast Asia. And thank you, everyone, for your participation and support. And we'll see you on the first Tuesday of every month. Thank you.